Hey guys, in our modern world of sealed windows, electric lights, and filtered air, it's easy to imagine a medieval hearth as the ultimate symbol of cozy domestic warmth. A crackling fire drawing family and neighbors together in a simple, welcoming glow. But the deeper reality was far more layered and quietly punishing than that familiar picture suggests. For the vast majority of people across the Middle Ages, breathing smoke wasn't a brief evening ritual or an occasional inconvenience. It was the unrelenting backdrop to every hour of every day, a constant companion that filled their lungs, stung their eyes, and shaped the very rhythm of life from the moment they woke until they lay down again at night. I'd love to know, as you settle in to listen tonight, where you're watching from and what particular slice of history you'd like us to explore next. If this kind of thoughtful, unhurried look into the past resonates with you, a simple like on the video is a gentle way to support more of these calm, long-form histories. And if you enjoy traveling back in time with us in this way, I hope you'll consider subscribing so the next quiet journey is waiting for you. But to truly understand what it meant to breathe that smoke hour after hour, year after year, we need to step across the threshold of an ordinary medieval home and feel the weight of the air inside it for ourselves. Imagine, then, a typical peasant cottage somewhere in the English countryside during the 13th or early 14th century, perhaps a small holding in the Midlands or East Anglia, where most people lived close to the land. These dwellings were rarely more than one main room, perhaps 12 or 15 feet across, built of wattle and daub, woven hazel branches plastered with a mixture of clay, straw, and dung that dried hard in the sun. The roof was thick thatch, layered from the eaves upward, and the floor was simply packed earth, sometimes scattered with rushes that would be swept out and replaced when they grew too foul. There were few windows, and those that existed were small slits or shuttered openings that let in more draft than light. In the very center of this single living space stood the hearth, a raised platform of clay or stone, perhaps a yard or two square, where the fire lived. At dawn, when the household stirred, the fire was rarely allowed to die completely. Overnight it had been banked, covered with a thick layer of ash or turf to smolder slowly and preserve the embers through the cold hours. Someone, often the wife or an older child, would kneel, rake away the covering, and feed fresh kindling and split logs onto the glowing heart. Within moments the flames would catch, and the first thin tendrils of smoke would begin their slow, upward journey. There was no chimney to draw it cleanly away. Instead, the smoke rose into the rafters, pooling against the underside of the thatch, seeking any gap it could find. A small smoke hole near the ridge, loose patches in the roofing, or simply the general permeability of the materials themselves. Much of it lingered, drifting lazily through the room in a perpetual hazy veil that caught the early light in soft, shifting columns. The air was never clear. Even on a good day, with the door propped open and a decent draft, the interior carried a constant tang of wood smoke, sometimes sharp and resinous if pine or oak was burning, sometimes heavier and more acrid when the fuel was damp or included peat or dried dung. Eyes watered almost at once. People learned to blink frequently, to tilt their heads just so when working close to the fire, or to position themselves slightly upwind of the hearth when the breeze cooperated. Children grew up knowing instinctively how to move through the haze without coughing too loudly. Adults accepted the low, persistent rasp in the throat as the normal sound of morning. Clothes absorbed the scent deeply. Woolen tunics and linen shifts carried it for days, even after washing in the stream or vat. Hair, skin, and bedding all took on the same signature. To step outside into the sharp, clean air of the fields or forest was, for a moment, almost startlingly fresh, until the realization set in that you would soon be stepping back inside. Cooking happened directly on or beside that central fire, because there was nowhere else for it to happen. A large iron pot might hang from a chain or tripod, simmering pottage, a thick stew of barley, beans, leeks, and whatever vegetables or scraps of meat the season provided. Flatbreads were baked on a stone slab propped near the flames, or oatcakes were toasted on a griddle. The smoke from these tasks mingled with the heat, rising in fragrant but choking clouds that made the simple act of preparing the day's first meal a slow, careful dance. A housewife might work with her back to the prevailing draft, eyes half closed against the sting, while children learned early to fetch water or stir without getting too close. The fire gave light as well as heat. In the dimmer months there were no candles or lamps for ordinary folk, so the hearth was both kitchen and lantern. Yet that same light came at a cost. Soot gradually blackened the roof beams overhead, turning pale thatch dark and greasy over the years. The rafters took on a permanent sheen, as if the house itself were slowly aging under a thin coat of tar. This was not mere discomfort. The smoke carried fine particles of carbon and other compounds deep into the lungs with every breath. Modern reconstructions of similar Iron Age and early medieval houses have measured indoor air pollution levels that would be considered hazardous today after just a few hours. People of the time had no scientific language for what they were experiencing, but they knew the practical consequences. Chronic coughs were common, especially in winter when the door stayed shut and the fire burned longer. Older men and women often spoke of a heaviness in the chest that worsened with age. Eye irritation could lead to persistent inflammation. In an era without spectacles or reliable remedies, many simply lived with reddened, watering eyes as a fact of existence. Yet the fire itself was non-negotiable. Without it, the damp, uninsulated cottage would grow bitterly cold. Food would remain raw. Light would vanish after sunset. The smoke was the price exacted for survival, warmth, and the simple continuation of daily life. What makes this reality especially striking is how ordinary it felt to those who lived it. No one complained of bad air in the abstract. The hearth was the pulsing heart of the home. Family life revolved around it. Meals were taken nearby, stories told in its flickering light, tools mended, wool spun, children taught. In the long winter evenings, the entire household might sit or lie in a rough semicircle, the smoke drifting above their heads like a low, restless ceiling. The youngest would sometimes lie flat on the floor where the air was marginally clearer, while adults endured the thicker layer higher up. Visitors arriving from outside would notice the haze immediately, but to the residents it had simply become the atmosphere of home. Familiar, inescapable, and strangely comforting in its constancy. As the morning gave way to the working day, many members of the household would leave the cottage for the fields, the woodland, or the village common. The fire might be banked once more or left to smolder under supervision if someone remained behind, the elderly, the very young, or a woman with small children. Even then, the interior never truly cleared. The thatch and daub walls held the scent and the residue for hours. Returning at midday or dusk meant stepping back into that same smoky embrace, the air thicker now if the fire had been stoked higher for the evening meal. The cycle repeated without variation, season after season. In summer, the door might stay open longer and the smoke dilute slightly with fresh breezes, but the hearth still burned for cooking and for the simple reassurance of flame. In winter, the smoke grew denser, the room smaller and more intimate, the trade-off sharper. We should pause here to notice something important about how this system actually made sense within the constraints of the time. Wood was plentiful in many regions, or at least more reliable than other fuels, and an open central hearth warmed the entire space more evenly than a corner fireplace ever could. The rising smoke helped preserve meats and fish hung from the rafters, acting as a natural curing agent against spoilage. It also deterred insects and rodents to some degree. These were not luxuries. They were quiet, practical adaptations born of necessity. People did not romanticize the smoke. They simply lived inside it, the way we today live inside the hum of refrigerators and the glow of screens, rarely stopping to question the background conditions that make ordinary life possible. Yet the longer one stayed with that reality, the more it shaped the body and the habits of daily existence. The constant low-level irritation meant that breathing itself became something one managed rather than took for granted. Voices carried differently in the hazy air. Conversations happened closer together, faces turned slightly away from the fire. Sleep came in the same space, on simple straw pallets or benches pushed against the walls, the fire reduced once more to glowing embers. The last task of the evening was often to bank it carefully, ensuring the household would wake to life rather than cold ash. And this was the experience for the great majority, those who made up the rural backbone of medieval society. In the coming hours we will look more closely at how the smoke interacted with the changing seasons, at the small domestic rituals that developed around it, and at the slow, uneven arrival of a technological shift that would eventually begin to lift that haze from some homes. The chimney. For now, though, the fire continues to burn in the center of the room. The smoke drifts upward through the thatch, and the long medieval day unfolds inside its quiet, persistent embrace. The hours stretch ahead, the wood crackles softly, and the air remains thick with the scent of centuries as the long medieval day unfolds inside its quiet, persistent embrace. The hours stretch ahead with the steady rhythm of a household adjusting its movements to the smoke rather than fighting it. By mid-morning, the fire has settled into a reliable burn, and the first major tasks of the day begin in earnest. The woman of the house, perhaps named Agnes or Matilda in the records of some village court roll, kneels once more to adjust the logs, her face turned slightly aside as a fresh plume rises. She stirs the pottage that will sustain the family until evening, the wooden spoon moving in slow circles while the smoke curls around her arms and settles into the folds of her woolen kirtle. Her husband and older sons have already left for the open fields or the Lord's domain, where the air moves freely under wide skies and the only smoke they encounter is the distant column from their own roof or a neighbor's. For those who remain, however, the cottage becomes a workshop as much as a home. A daughter sits on a low stool near the doorway, where the draft is kinder, twisting wool into thread on a drop spindle that clicks softly against the packed earth floor. The fibers carry the scent of the hearth with them. Later, when the cloth is woven and worn, it will release that same faint tang with every movement. The smoke's presence shaped these small domestic rituals in ways that feel almost invisible until one lingers inside them. Every few days the rushes on the floor would be swept out and fresh ones strewn, but the soot that had drifted down overnight left a fine black powder that no amount of sweeping could entirely erase. The walls themselves absorbed it, the daub darkening over the seasons until the interior took on the color of perpetual twilight even at noon. Yet these were not merely nuisances to be endured. They were woven into the practical logic of survival. Hanging strips of salted pork or fish from the rafters allowed the rising smoke to cure them slowly, turning what might have spoiled in the damp English climate into food that could last through the lean months. The same haze kept fleas and other vermin at bay more effectively than any herbal remedy alone. Families understood this instinctively, the way they understood the turning of the seasons or the proper depth to plant barley. The smoke was not an enemy. It was a working partner in the endless labor of keeping a household alive. As the sun climbed higher, the quality of the air inside changed with the weather outside. In high summer, when the door could stand open from dawn until dusk and the thatch grew warm and dry, the smoke thinned noticeably. Breezes carried much of it away through the smoke hole or the loose weave of the walls, and the room felt almost spacious despite its modest size. Children might play just beyond the threshold, their laughter drifting in alongside the scent of cut grass and wild herbs, while inside the fire burned lower, used mainly for the midday meal. Eyes watered less, coughs eased, and the household moved with a lighter step. Yet even then the haze never vanished completely. It simply retreated to the upper reaches of the room, waiting for the evening when the door would be pulled shut against the cooling air and the fire would be fed once more. The contrast made the return indoors feel heavier, the smoke more intimate, as though the cottage itself drew a deep breath and held it close. Winter, of course, told a different story. The short days and long nights closed the world in tight, and the fire became the single source of light, heat, and hope. Fuel was gathered with greater care. Deadfall from the woods, carefully dried peat if it could be had, or even dried dung cakes shaped by hand and stacked beside the hearth. The door stayed latched against the wind, the smoke hole partially covered with a board or a scrap of hide, and the interior filled with a denser, more acrid cloud that pressed down on everything. Breathing grew shallower by habit. People learned to speak in lower tones so their voices would carry through the thickened air without triggering a cough. At night, the family slept in a single huddled line along the wall farthest from the prevailing draft, the youngest closest to the floor where the clearest layer of air still lingered. The fire was banked with extra care before sleep, its embers glowing like a quiet promise beneath the ash. Morning would bring the same ritual of raking and feeding, but the cold would have seeped into the bones overnight, making the first tendrils of smoke feel almost welcome despite the sting. These seasonal shifts were not abstract. They left their mark on bodies and on the quiet patterns of family life. Older villagers spoke of the winter chest, a persistent tightness that arrived with the first hard frosts and lingered until the longer days returned. Children grew up with the habit of rubbing their eyes as naturally as they rubbed their hands for warmth. Yet within these constraints, small comforts and adaptations took root. Stories told around the hearth, tales of saints or local legends passed down from parent to child, were delivered in the same low, measured cadence that allowed the speaker to draw breath between phrases without inhaling too deeply. Spinning or mending tools happened in the same half-circle arrangement, each person instinctively finding the spot where the smoke rose above their head rather than into their face. The very architecture of the cottage encouraged this. The central hearth meant warmth reached every corner, but it also meant the smoke reached every corner too, creating a shared atmosphere that bound the household together more tightly than any spoken vow. What modern ears might find hardest to imagine is how rarely anyone voiced complaint about the smoke itself. It was simply the medium in which life was lived, as unremarkable as the rain or the turning of the harvest. Court records and manorial accounts from the period mention disputes over firewood rights, over the right to gather kindling in the Lord's wood, or over the occasional cottage fire that escaped its hearth and consumed the thatch in a sudden roar. But the daily haze itself appears only indirectly, through references to ointments made from herbs, or through the steady demand for new thatch once the old had grown too heavy with soot. The people of the Middle Ages did not think of their air as polluted in our sense. They thought of it as the necessary price of fire, and fire was the difference between a living home and a cold shell. By the later decades of the 13th century, however, faint cracks were beginning to appear in this long-established pattern, though they remained invisible to most villagers. In the wealthier manor houses and the halls of minor gentry, experiments with stone or brick fireplaces built against the wall were slowly spreading. These structures allowed a rudimentary chimney, a simple flue cut through the roof or, more commonly at first, a timber hood that funneled smoke toward a vent. The change did not arrive everywhere at once, nor did it arrive for the sake of comfort alone. It came because larger buildings with upper floors made a central hearth impractical. The smoke would have filled the rooms above as readily as the one below. Yet even in these early chimneys the improvement was partial. The flues were often narrow, the draft imperfect, and the fire still produced more smoke than the channel could carry away cleanly. In the cottages of the peasantry, the central hearth remained the unquestioned center of existence, its smoke continuing its slow, patient work on lungs and thatch alike. As the afternoon light began to slant across the fields, the family members who had worked outdoors would return one by one, stamping mud from their boots and bringing with them the clean scent of turned earth or cut hay. The cottage would fill again with voices and movement, the fire stoked higher for the evening meal. The pottage would thicken with whatever the day had yielded. Perhaps a handful of wild greens, a few eggs, or the last of the winter stores. The smoke, which had drifted more freely during the quieter hours, now thickened once more with the renewed activity, wrapping the returning workers in the same familiar embrace they had left behind at dawn. Conversations turned to the small events of the day. The state of the crops, the price of ale at the village market, the latest rumor from the Lord Steward. All of it unfolded in the same hazy light, the words rising and falling like the smoke itself. And still the day had more hours to give. As twilight gathered outside, the fire became the only reliable source of illumination once again. Tools were laid aside, prayers were murmured in the half-dark, and the household settled into the quiet routines that would carry them towards sleep. The youngest child might be given the task of fetching a final armful of kindling, learning by touch and repetition where the driest pieces lay stacked against the wall. An older sibling would bank the fire with deliberate care, layering ash over the glowing heart so that it would survive until morning without flaring up and consuming too much precious fuel. The air grew stiller, the smoke lazier in its drift, and the cottage seemed to draw inward upon itself, preparing for the long night ahead. Yet even as this ordinary evening repeated itself across thousands of such homes, larger currents were stirring beyond the village. The 14th century would bring changes, some gradual, some sudden, that would test the resilience of this smoky world. Population pressures, the slow spread of new building techniques, and the occasional voice of a chronicler noting the discomfort of indoor air all hinted that the reign of the open central hearth was not destined to last forever. For now, though the fire crackles softly once more, the wood releases its steady heat, and the smoke continues its patient journey upward through the thatch, carrying with it the scent of another medieval day drawing to its close. The household rests in its familiar haze, and the long arc of adaptation that will one day reshape these interiors is only beginning to stir. Still many decades away as the household rests in its familiar haze, and the long arc of adaptation that will one day reshape these interiors is only beginning to stir. Still many decades away, the night settles fully around the cottage like a heavy woolen cloak. The banked embers glow faintly beneath their covering of ash, casting a subdued red light that barely reaches the rafters where the last wisps of smoke linger against the blackened thatch. Sleep comes unevenly for some. The persistent low-level irritation in the throat or the occasional shift of a log sends a fresh thread of haze drifting downward, prompting a quiet cough or the instinctive turn of a head toward the clearer air near the floor. Children nestle closer to their parents, not only for warmth but because the lowest layer of the room remains marginally kinder to young lungs. Outside, the English countryside lies quiet under a starlit sky, the fields and woods free of the scent that clings so stubbornly to every person and possession within. Yet by the time the first pale light of dawn filters through the shuttered openings, the ritual begins anew. Raking the embers, feeding fresh fuel, watching the smoke rise once more in its patient, unhurried columns. The 14th century, however, would quietly test the limits of this centuries-old arrangement in ways that no single household could fully perceive at the time. Population had been rising steadily for generations, pressing harder against the available land and timber resources. In many villages the demand for firewood grew sharper, forcing families to burn whatever was closest at hand, sometimes damper wood from younger coppices, or a greater share of dry dung and peat when oak and ash became harder to gather without encroaching on the Lord's carefully guarded woodlands. The smoke itself grew thicker and more acrid on some mornings, carrying a heavier bite that lingered longer in the chest. Records from manorial courts hint at the strain through fines for unauthorized wood-taking or disputes over rights to gather fallen branches. But the deeper consequence remained intimate and unspoken. The air inside the cottage simply became a little less forgiving, the daily haze a touch more insistent. People adapted as they always had, adjusting their positions around the hearth, speaking in the same measured tones, and accepting the heavier rasp in the throat as part of the turning year. Then came the years that would leave a mark far beyond the smoke. The Great Famine of the early 1310s had already shown how fragile the balance could be, with failed harvests driving desperate measures. Burning green would that produced even more smoke, or crowding more bodies into the same small spaces for shared warmth. But the true turning point arrived mid-century, when the plague swept across Europe and reached the English shores in 1348. In the space of 2 years, entire villages emptied, fields lay fallow, and the sudden scarcity of labor began to shift the quiet economics of daily life. For those who survived, the immediate aftermath brought a strange, somber kind of relief in the countryside. More land per person, slightly easier access to timber, and, in some cases, the chance to repair or even enlarge a cottage with better materials. Yet the open hearth endured unchanged. The fire still burned at the center, the smoke still rose through the thatch, and the routines of morning and evening continued with the same patient choreography. What had altered was the scale of the world around it. Fewer neighbors meant fewer shared stories around neighboring fires, and the smoke of one cottage drifted into a quieter landscape. It is worth pausing here to notice how the smoke's impact revealed itself differently across social lines, even within the same village. While the peasant household endured the central hearth as an unyielding constant, a short walk toward the manor house told a subtly different story. There, in the hall of a modest knight or prosperous freeholder, the first tentative experiments with wall fireplaces and rudimentary chimneys had begun to appear by the late 13th century and spread more noticeably after the plague years. These were not grand innovations born of sudden enlightenment but practical responses to the needs of larger, sometimes two-storied buildings. A stone or brick chimney stack rising against an exterior wall allowed the fire to be moved from the center of the room, drawing the smoke upward and outward with greater efficiency. The improvement was far from perfect. The flues were often rough, the draft unreliable on windy days, and soot still accumulated. But the difference inside the hall was palpable. The air at head height cleared enough that eyes watered less and voices carried without the constant low rasp. Servants and family members could sit closer to the warmth without shifting constantly to avoid the worst of the haze. For the first time in some households, the upper chambers could be used for sleeping or storage without filling with drifting smoke from below. Even so, the change came slowly and unevenly. In the manor hall, the central hearth might still be kept for certain feasts or when the chimney needed cleaning, a reminder that tradition and practicality often overlapped. The smoke that escaped the new flue still carried the same scent of wood and resin, but now it rose cleanly above the roofline rather than pooling against the thatch. Outside observers, traveling clerics or merchants, sometimes noted the contrast when entering a village. The peasant cottages with their low, hazy doorways versus the sharper silhouette of a chimney stack marking the manor. Yet, for the majority, the old ways held firm. Rebuilding a cottage with a proper chimney required stone or brick that most families could not afford, skilled masons who were scarce even after the plague, and the Lord's permission for any substantial alteration to a holding. The open hearth remained the simplest, most reliable solution within the material limits of the time, and so the smoke continued its daily companionship for the great mass of people. As the century wore on and the immediate shock of the plague receded, another layer of adaptation began to emerge in the towns. Urban life had always carried its own smoky character, but the denser clustering of homes amplified the problem in new ways. In places like London or York, rows of timber-framed houses pressed close together, each with its central hearth or, increasingly, a shared party wall that might incorporate a rudimentary chimney. Smoke from one house could drift into the next through gaps in the construction, and the narrow streets trapped the collective haze, creating a low-lying pall that mixed with the smells of workshops and cookshops. Here the practical inconveniences became harder to ignore. Civic ordinances began to appear, regulating the height of chimneys or the types of fuel that could be burned to reduce the risk of fire spreading from hearth to thatch. Yet even in these growing towns, the majority of ordinary artisans and laborers still lived with the open fire, the smoke rising through whatever vent the roof allowed. The difference was one of degree rather than kind. The air inside remained thick, the daily rituals of banking and stoking unchanged, but now the background haze of the street added its own layer when one stepped outside. Back in the countryside, where most people still lived, the rhythm of the smoky household continued with only the gentlest of shifts. A family that had lost members to the plague might find itself in a slightly larger cottage, perhaps with an extra bay added during rebuilding, but the hearth stayed where it had always been. The smoke still cured the winter stores hanging from the rafters, still deterred pests, still provided the only reliable light after sunset. Children born after the Great Mortality grew up in the same hazy atmosphere their parents and grandparents had known, learning the same instinctive tilts of the head and adjustments of posture. The chroniclers, when they bothered to mention domestic life at all, spoke more often of the broader upheavals, of labor shortages and rising wages, than of the air people breathed inside their homes. Yet the discomfort was real enough that herbal remedies for eye irritation and chest complaints appear more frequently in the surviving medical texts of the period. Small clues that the smoke's toll had not gone entirely unnoticed. By the closing decades of the 14th century, the stirrings that had seemed so distant only a generation earlier were beginning to take clearer shape. In wealthier ecclesiastical buildings and royal residences, grander chimney systems were appearing, their flues designed with greater care to improve the draw and reduce backsmoke. Word of these improvements traveled along trade routes and through the accounts of returning soldiers or pilgrims, planting the idea that a home without constant indoor smoke might one day be possible for more than just the elite. For the ordinary cottage, however, the open hearth remained the steadfast center, its fire crackling through another winter, another spring planting, another harvest season. The smoke continued to rise, patient and persistent, shaping the days and nights of those who lived within its embrace, even as the first faint outlines of a different future could be glimpsed on the horizon. And so the long medieval day, with all its quiet accommodations to the haze, stretched onward into the 15th century. In one such cottage, the morning fire is being coaxed back to life once more, the smoke curling upward through the thatch as it has for centuries, while beyond the village the pace of change begins to quicken in ways that will eventually reach even the most humble threshold. The household moves through its familiar tasks, the air thick with the scent of wood and centuries of habit, and the story of how that smoke was slowly, unevenly tamed is only beginning to unfold in the wider world. The household moves through its familiar tasks, the air thick with the scent of wood and centuries of habit, and the story of how that smoke was slowly, unevenly tamed is only beginning to unfold in the wider world. In the 15th century, that unfolding remained deliberate and patchy, dictated less by any sudden revelation about the discomfort of indoor haze than by the gradual accumulation of small economic shifts, building skills, and the quiet ambitions of those who could afford to experiment with their homes. Across much of rural England, the open central hearth still reigned in the majority of cottages, its smoke continuing to pool against the thatch and coat the rafters in the same familiar black sheen that generations had simply accepted as the cost of warmth. Yet here and there, in the holdings of more prosperous freeholders or yeomen whose families had benefited from the post-plague redistribution of land, one could begin to glimpse the first modest departures from tradition. A stone or brick-lined fireplace might be built against an exterior wall during a rebuilding, not because the family had suddenly grown intolerant of smoke, but because the new structure allowed for a second story or a partition chamber where the air could remain clearer for sleeping or storing cloth. The chimney itself was often rudimentary at first, a simple flue of timber and clay or, in luckier cases, local stone, drawing the smoke upward with only partial efficiency. On still days the draft might falter, sending a back puff of haze into the room, but on most mornings the improvement was noticeable enough that eyes watered less fiercely and conversations flowed more freely around the fire. These early adoptions were never universal, and they carried their own quiet ironies. The very households that could afford the change were often those whose daily labor had already eased somewhat. A yeoman with a larger plot might have the surplus to hire a mason or trade for better fuel, yet the smoke that had once cured his winter bacon now escaped too cleanly to perform the same preserving work, requiring him to find other methods or pay more attention to salting. For the majority of smaller tenants, however, the central hearth endured unchanged. Manorial records from the period still describe cottages as single-bay structures open to the roof, their interiors defined by the hearth's position and the slow accumulation of soot that marked the passing years like rings in a tree. The practical advantages that had sustained the old system for so long remained compelling. An open fire warmed the entire space evenly, required no expensive materials, and could be tended by anyone in the household without specialized knowledge. The smoke, for all its irritation, continued to serve as a silent guardian against rot and infestation, and in an era when every ounce of food mattered, that benefit outweighed the chronic rasp in the throat or the persistent watering of the eyes. As the century progressed, the contrast between different kinds of homes became more visible to those who traveled the countryside. A merchant or cleric passing through a village might notice how the newer chimneys on a handful of larger farmsteads rose straight and purposeful above the roofline, their smoke carried high and dispersed on the wind rather than lingering at head height. Inside those dwellings the air at eye level felt lighter, almost startlingly so to anyone accustomed to the older style. Family members could sit closer to the flames without constantly adjusting their posture, and the youngest children no longer needed to hug the floor quite so instinctively for clearer breaths. Yet even here the change was incomplete. Many such houses retained a secondary hearth or kept the old central fire for certain tasks, and the thatch or early tile roofs still absorbed some residue. The transition was less a clean break than a layering of old and new, shaped by the same material realities. Available timber, local stone, the cost of labor that had always governed domestic life. For the peasant family in the traditional cottage next door, the smoke remained the unchanging atmosphere of home, as familiar as the rhythm of the seasons or the turning of the harvest. Winters in these later medieval decades still tested the limits of endurance in the older homes. With the door latched tight against frost and the fire fed through the long nights, the haze grew denser than ever, pressing down on the household like a low, restless ceiling. People learned to bank the embers with extra care, using turf or ash to preserve heat without excessive smoke. Yet the morning ritual of raking and feeding still sent the first plumes curling upward before anyone had fully shaken off sleep. Chronic coughs and eye complaints appear more frequently in the herbal remedy collections and occasional coroner's rolls of the period. Small clues that the body paid its daily toll even if no one framed the problem in terms of air quality. Children born in these smoky interiors grew up with the same instinctive habits their parents had known. Tilting the head when stirring the pot, speaking in measured phrases to avoid drawing too deep a breath mid-sentence, positioning themselves in the clearer layers near the floor during the evening meal. The fire remained the pulsing center of existence, its light and warmth the only reliable companions after sunset, and the smoke its inseparable shadow. What makes this slow evolution especially revealing is how it reflected broader currents in late medieval society. The 15th century saw the gradual rise of a middling sort, yeomen, prosperous artisans, and small landowners, who began to invest in the comfort and permanence of their dwellings. Improved agricultural techniques and the slow recovery of population after the earlier plagues meant that some families could afford to rebuild with better materials or add features once reserved for the gentry. A chimney stack, modest though it might be, became one such marker of modest prosperity, not because it eliminated smoke entirely but because it pushed the haze higher and allowed the living space below to feel more like a room and less like a cavern filled with drifting clouds. Civic authorities in larger towns began to take notice as well. Ordinances in places like London or Norwich occasionally restricted the height of chimneys or the burning of particularly smoky fuels to reduce the risk of fire spreading between closely packed houses. Yet these regulations touched only the edges of the problem. In the countryside, the open hearth persisted wherever resources or permission constrained change, and the majority of people continued to breathe the same air their ancestors had, day after unbroken day. By the closing years of the century, the stirrings of transformation had grown slightly more noticeable, though still far from widespread. In some regions, particularly where local stone was plentiful or where trade brought new ideas from the continent, a handful of cottages began to incorporate hooded fireplaces or simple external flues during routine repairs. The difference inside was subtle but cumulative. The smoke that had once filled the entire volume of the room now found a clearer path upward, leaving the lower air marginally fresher and the rafters less blackened over time. Families who made the change often spoke of it in practical terms. Less need to replace thatch so frequently, fewer sparks landing on bedding, a slightly easier time for the elderly whose chests had grown tight from decades of haze. Yet the old ways did not vanish overnight. Many households kept the central hearth for cooking larger meals or during feasts, reverting to the familiar smoky embrace when the new chimney proved temperamental in high winds or when fuel was scarce. The smoke, after all, had never been merely a nuisance. It had been part of the texture of survival, a constant companion that shaped movement, conversation, and even the very scent of daily life. As the 15th century gave way to the early decades of the 16th, these incremental shifts began to accelerate in certain pockets of the realm, driven by the same forces of economic opportunity and changing expectations that had been gathering strength for generations. In the prosperous south and east of England, where cloth production and improved farming had created pockets of relative comfort, more yeomen and better-off tenants started to rebuild with chimneys as a matter of course rather than exception. The air inside their homes grew clearer still, allowing for the addition of upper chambers that no longer filled with drifting smoke from below. Servants and family alike could move through the day with fewer pauses to rub stinging eyes or clear irritated throats. For those who still lived in the traditional single-room cottages, however, the central hearth continued its patient work, the smoke rising through the thatch each morning and evening as it had for centuries, carrying with it the quiet continuity of rural existence. The wider world was changing around these homes, but the daily reality inside them remained rooted in the same practical necessities that had always defined the medieval experience. And yet the story of that smoke, its persistence, its subtle toll, and the slow emergence of alternatives, continued to evolve in ways that no single household could fully anticipate. In the years ahead, new pressures and opportunities would test the old arrangements more thoroughly. The increasing use of coal in some regions, the spread of building techniques learned from urban centers, and the gradual rise in expectations about what a home should feel like. For now, though, in the ordinary cottage the fire is once again being coaxed back to life at the close of another day, the smoke curling lazily upward as the family settles into its familiar routines. The haze settles around them like an old acquaintance, the wood crackles softly, and the long rhythm of adaptation that will one day lighten the air inside these walls is still gathering momentum, moving forward in its own unhurried measure across the English countryside. The haze settles around them like an old acquaintance, the wood crackles softly, and the long rhythm of adaptation that will one day lighten the air inside these walls is still gathering momentum, moving forward in its own unhurried measure across the English countryside. As the 16th century unfolded, those quiet pressures, with shortages in regions where centuries of clearing and coppicing had thinned the available supply, the slow diffusion of building knowledge from market towns, and a subtle shift in what families expected from the spaces they inhabited, began to nudge more households toward change. In the prosperous southeast, where cloth-making and improved farming had allowed some yeomen to accumulate modest surpluses, the addition of a chimney during a routine repair or a full rebuilding became less of a rarity and more of a considered choice. The flue, often constructed of local brick or daub-covered timber, rose against an exterior wall, drawing the smoke upward with a reliability that the old central hearth could never quite match. Inside, the difference revealed itself gradually. The air at head height felt lighter on ordinary mornings, the sting in the eyes less immediate, and the rafters no longer accumulated quite so thick a coat of soot year after year. Families who made the transition noticed how conversations around the fire could now linger without the constant small adjustments of posture or the habitual pauses to clear the throat. Children still learned the old instinctive tilts of the head, but they did so less urgently, and the youngest no longer needed to press quite so close to the floor for relief. Yet this evolution carried its own practical contradictions, ones that only became clear once the new arrangement had settled into daily use. The chimney pulled smoke away more efficiently, yes, but it also carried away some of the warmth that the open central hearth had once spread evenly throughout the single room. On cold winter nights the family might find themselves drawing closer to the fire than before, or adding an extra layer of bedding to compensate for the draft that now moved more freely through the space. The curing effect on meats and fish hanging from the rafters diminished noticeably. What had once been gently preserved by the constant haze now required more salt, more careful smoking in a separate shed, or simply more frequent use before spoilage set in. These were not complaints voiced aloud in any formal record, but they surface indirectly in household accounts and the occasional note from a visiting steward. The old ways had been inefficient in comfort but remarkably efficient in the small economies of survival. For many, the trade-off felt worth making only when the materials and labor could be afforded without sacrificing the harvest or the winter stores. In the ordinary cottages that still clung to the traditional layout, and these remained the majority well into the century, the smoke continued its patient companionship without interruption. The morning ritual of raking embers and feeding fresh wood or, in districts where wood had grown scarce, a greater share of dried dung or peat, sent the same familiar plumes curling upward through the thatch. The air thickened as it always had, carrying the sharper tang of whatever fuel the season provided, and the household moved through its tasks with the same measured choreography born of long habit. A wife might stir the breakfast pottage with her face turned slightly aside, her daughter spinning wool nearer the door where the draught offered a sliver of clearer air, while the men prepared for the fields outside. The scent clung to clothing and hair as it always had, a signature that travelers could detect from yards away when approaching a village at dusk. Eye irritation remained a constant, treated with the same herbal washes or simply endured as part of the day's texture. Chronic coughs still marked the passage of the years, especially among those who had breathed the haze for decades. Yet the fire's warmth and light remained non-negotiable. Without it, the damp walls would chill to the bone, the evening meal would stay raw, and the long winter darkness would close in without relief. What began to alter the picture more noticeably in some regions was the gradual introduction of coal as a fuel, first in the towns and then, more tentatively, in the countryside. By the middle decades of the 16th century, shortages of suitable timber around growing urban centers like London had pushed merchants to ship coal from the northeast coalfields down the coast. For households that could obtain it, often those near navigable rivers or with connections to the trade, the new fuel burned hotter and longer than wood, offering a practical advantage when nights grew bitter. But the smoke it produced told a different story. Coal released a denser, more sulfurous haze, one that bit deeper into the lungs and left a harsher residue on the walls and thatch. Eyes watered more fiercely, throats rasped with a new rawness, and the scent that permeated clothing and bedding carried a sharper, almost metallic edge that no amount of airing could fully dispel. Families experimenting with coal in their central hearths soon learned to mix it sparingly with wood or peat, seeking a balance that preserved heat without overwhelming the air they breathed. In the towns, where rows of houses stood shoulder to shoulder, the collective smoke from coal fires added another layer to the already hazy streets, prompting early civic attempts to regulate chimney heights or fuel types. Yet even here the majority of ordinary artisans still relied on whatever burned cheapest and longest, accepting the thicker atmosphere as the price of warmth in a crowded world. The contrast between rural and urban experience grew sharper as the century advanced. In the countryside, the open hearth endured longest where land remained plentiful and timber could still be gathered or coppiced within reasonable distance. A peasant family in a remote Midland village might pass an entire generation without ever seeing a chimney stack rise above a neighbor's roof, their daily rhythm unchanged from the patterns established centuries earlier. The smoke continued to serve its quiet protective roles, deterring insects, preserving stores, providing the only steady light after sunset, and the household adapted around it with the same uncomplaining practicality. In the larger market towns, however, the pressure of numbers and the spread of new building techniques accelerated the shift. Timber-framed houses began to incorporate proper brick chimneys as a matter of course during repairs or new constructions, their flues designed with better drafts learned from continental examples or from the halls of wealthier patrons. Inside these dwellings, the air at living height cleared enough that families could add upper rooms without filling them with drifting haze from below. Servants and apprentices could work without the constant low-level irritation that had once been taken for granted, and the evenings felt subtly more spacious, the voices carrying with less effort through the room. Even in these improving homes, the change remained partial and uneven. A chimney might draw well on a breezy day but falter when the wind shifted, sending puffs of smoke back into the chamber and forcing the family to open a window or door despite the cold. Soot still accumulated, though higher up and less intrusively, and the fire itself required more careful tending to prevent sparks from escaping the flue. The lived reality for those who straddled the old and new worlds. Perhaps a yeoman who had added a chimney to one end of his cottage, while keeping the central hearth for certain tasks, revealed the quiet compromises involved. The smoke had never been merely an inconvenience. It had been woven into the very fabric of how warmth, light, cooking, and preservation all functioned together. Removing it partially meant rethinking small domestic habits that had gone unquestioned for lifetimes. Where to hang the bacon, how to position the children during the evening meal, even the instinctive way one breathed while stirring the pot. As the Tudor period gave way to the early Stuart years, these incremental adaptations continued to ripple outward from the wealthier households and the urban centers, reaching farther into the countryside with each passing decade. The dissolution of the monasteries earlier in the century had released stores of building stone and brick into local markets in some regions, lowering the cost of a modest chimney for those who could seize the opportunity. Agricultural improvements and the slow growth of population after the earlier plagues meant that more families could afford the labor and materials without endangering their holdings. Yet for the smallest tenants and laborers, the central open hearth remained the steadfast center of existence, its smoke rising each morning and evening through the thatch as it had always done. The haze settled around them with the same quiet familiarity, the wood or mixed fuel crackling softly, and the daily tasks unfolding in the same half-lit atmosphere that had shaped medieval life for centuries. The story of that smoke, however, was far from static even in these seemingly unchanging cottages. Larger forces, shifting patterns of land use, the increasing availability of coal along river routes, and the gradual spread of ideas about domestic comfort carried by returning soldiers, merchants, and traveling craftsmen, were quietly preparing the ground for more widespread change. In one such traditional holding, the evening fire is being banked once more with deliberate care, the embers covered to preserve life through the night, while outside the English countryside lies under the same starlit sky that has watched these routines for generations. The air inside remains thick with the scent of centuries. The family rests in its familiar embrace, and the long, patient transition toward clearer interiors continues its unhurried advance, shaped by the same practical necessities and quiet ambitions that have always governed how people make their homes livable. The days ahead will bring new variations in fuel and construction, new balances struck between warmth and breathable air, and the smoke will continue to tell its own subtle history of adaptation, moving forward across the landscape one hearth at a time. The days ahead will bring new variations in fuel and construction, new balances struck between warmth and breathable air, and the smoke will continue to tell its own subtle history of adaptation, moving forward across the landscape one hearth at a time. By the early decades of the 17th century, those variations had become more visible in the prosperous districts of southern and eastern England, where the steady growth of trade and agriculture allowed a wider circle of yeomen and substantial tenants to rebuild or improve their homes with proper chimneys as a standard feature rather than an occasional luxury. The flue, now often built of brick or local stone with a more carefully angled throat to improve the draw, carried the smoke cleanly above the roofline on most days, leaving the air at head height noticeably freer than it had been in the older central hearth cottages that still dotted the neighboring holdings. Families who made the change found that morning tasks could be completed with fewer instinctive pauses to rub the eyes or clear the throat. The pottage simmered with less acrid drift, and the evening gatherings around the fire felt subtly more spacious, the voices carrying without the constant low rasp that had once marked every conversation. Children born into these improved interiors still learned the old domestic rhythms, but they did so in an atmosphere that no longer pressed quite so heavily against their young lungs. Even so, the transition carried its own quiet limitations that only revealed themselves through daily use. The chimney drew smoke away efficiently, yet it also pulled heat upward more rapidly than the open hearth ever had, forcing households to burn greater quantities of fuel to maintain the same warmth through the long winter nights. In districts where wood remained abundant, this was manageable. Elsewhere, families turned increasingly to coal shipped from the northern coalfields along the rivers and coastal routes. Coal burned hotter and longer, a practical boon when nights turned bitter, but the smoke it produced was heavier and more sulphurous, carrying a sharper bite that lingered in the throat even after the fire had been banked for sleep. The residue it left on the new chimney walls was darker and more stubborn, requiring periodic sweeping that became a regular household chore rather than the occasional task it had once been. For those still living in the traditional single-room cottages without chimneys, the contrast grew sharper when they visited a neighbor's improved dwelling. The air inside felt lighter, almost foreign, while their own home continued to wrap them in the same thick, familiar haze each morning and evening. Across much of rural England, the older arrangement persisted longest among the smaller tenants and laborers, whose modest holdings left little room for the expense of rebuilding. In these cottages, the central hearth remained the unchanging heart of existence, the morning ritual of raking embers and feeding whatever fuel could be afforded, mixed wood and peat, or a careful measure of coal where it could be obtained, sending the same patient plumes curling upward through the thatch or early tile roofs. The smoke settled into the rafters and walls as it always had, coating the interior in a perpetual twilight even at midday and carrying the tang of the day's fuel deep into clothing, hair, and bedding. Eye irritation and the low, persistent cough remained constants of daily life, accepted not as ailments to be cured, but as part of the texture of survival in a world where warmth and light after sunset could not be taken for granted. The practical benefits that had sustained the open hearth for centuries still held. The rising smoke continued to cure meats and fish hung from the beams, deterred insects more effectively than any herbal alternative, and provided the only reliable illumination once darkness fell. Families moved through their tasks with the same measured choreography, instinctively positioning themselves in the clearer layers near the floor or door, speaking in the same unhurried cadence that allowed breath to be drawn between phrases without drawing too deeply from the thickened air. In the growing market towns and the expanding suburbs of London, the picture shifted more rapidly under the pressure of numbers and the demands of denser living. Rows of timber-framed houses stood shoulder to shoulder, each now more likely to incorporate a brick chimney during construction or repair, their flues rising in uneven ranks above the rooftops. The collective smoke from hundreds of hearths created a low-lying pall that mixed with the odors of workshops and cookshops, turning the streets into a hazy corridor, especially on still, damp mornings. Civic authorities responded with ordinances that regulated chimney heights and the burning of particularly smoky fuels. Yet enforcement remained patchy, and the majority of ordinary artisans and laborers still relied on whatever burned cheapest and longest. Inside these urban homes, the air at living height cleared somewhat compared with the older central hearths, but the background haze from neighboring chimneys often drifted back through open windows or gaps in the construction, reminding residents that the problem had simply moved from the room to the wider neighborhood. The scent of coal smoke became a signature of town life, sharper and more persistent than the wood smoke of the countryside, and those who traveled between the two worlds noticed the difference immediately upon returning to their rural holdings. What makes these 17th-century shifts especially telling is how they reflected broader changes in the expectations people placed on their domestic spaces. The Tudor and early Stuart periods had seen the gradual spread of ideas about comfort and privacy, carried by printed books, traveling craftsmen, and the example of wealthier halls where grander chimney systems had long been the norm. A yeoman who had prospered through careful farming or a fortunate marriage might now view a proper chimney not merely as a practical upgrade but as a marker of modest respectability, a way to provide his family with air that felt less punishing through the long winter months. Yet for every household that embraced the change, several more remained bound by the material realities of their holdings. The cost of brick and labor, the availability of suitable stone, the lord's or landlord's permission for substantial alterations. The smoke, in its various forms, continued to shape the rhythm of daily existence across all these layers of society, from the clearest manor hall to the humblest laborer's cottage. As the century advanced and the turmoil of civil war gave way to the Restoration, the pace of adaptation continued its uneven course. In some regions, the increasing availability of coal along improved river routes made it the fuel of choice for those who could afford the transport, its hotter burn offering a welcome relief from the constant need to feed the fire through the night. The smoke it produced, however, demanded new habits. Windows cracked open even in cold weather to relieve the heavier haze, or a greater reliance on the chimney's draw when it functioned well. In the countryside, the open hearth endured in thousands of modest dwellings, its smoke rising each morning with the same patient persistence that had defined medieval life for centuries. Families there still banked the embers with deliberate care before sleep, still woke to the ritual of raking and feeding, still accepted the low-level irritation as the unavoidable companion to warmth and light. The contrast between old and new had become part of the landscape itself, visible in the silhouette of a village where a handful of chimney stacks rose above a sea of thatched roofs still venting their haze through smoke holes or loose thatch. By the closing decades of the 17th century, the story of indoor smoke had begun to intersect with larger transformations that would eventually reach even the most remote holdings. Agricultural improvements and the slow expansion of internal trade meant that materials and techniques once confined to the wealthier South were spreading northward and westward. Printed advice on household management began to mention the advantages of proper chimneys and the careful management of coal fires, planting the idea that clearer air inside the home might one day be within reach for more than just the prosperous. Yet the daily reality for the great majority remained rooted in the same practical necessities that had always governed life: the need for heat, for cooked food, for light after sunset, and the acceptance of whatever atmosphere those necessities produced. In one such traditional cottage, the evening fire is being tended once more as twilight deepens, the smoke drifting lazily upward through the familiar thatch while outside the English countryside settles under the same quiet sky. The air inside remains thick with the scent of wood and the residue of centuries. The family moves through its closing routines with the same instinctive adjustments that have shaped generations and the long history of breathing that smoke. Its quiet toll, its practical benefits, and the slow, uneven emergence of alternatives continues to unfold across the landscape in ways that no single household can yet fully perceive. New pressures from population growth and the expanding use of coal are already stirring in the distance, promising further variations in the balance between warmth and breathable air, and the smoke itself will keep rising, patient and persistent, carrying forward the subtle record of how people lived and adapted one hearth at a time into the century ahead. The days ahead will bring new variations in fuel and construction, new balances struck between warmth and breathable air, and the smoke itself will keep rising, patient and persistent, carrying forward the subtle record of how people lived and adapted one hearth at a time into the century ahead. Into the 18th century, those new pressures from population growth and the expanding use of coal began to reshape the smoky interiors of English homes in more noticeable ways, though the change remained as gradual and uneven as the landscape itself. In the prosperous South and East, where agricultural improvements and growing trade had lifted the circumstances of many yeoman and tenant farmers, the chimney had become a standard feature in most newly built or refurbished dwellings. The flue, now typically constructed of well-laid brick with a smoother throat to enhance the draw, carried the smoke high above the roofline on all but the stillest days, leaving the air at head height clearer and less insistent than it had been in the older central hearth cottages that still stood alongside them. Families in these improved homes noticed how the morning ritual of tending the fire felt less punishing. Eyes watered less fiercely as the pottage simmered, and the evening gatherings around the hearth allowed for longer, easier conversations without the constant small adjustments of posture or the habitual clearing of the throat that had once punctuated every exchange. Yet the shift to coal as the dominant fuel in many of these households introduced its own quiet complications. Coal burned hotter and longer than wood, a practical advantage when winter nights stretched long and fuel had to be carried from greater distances. But the smoke it produced was denser and carried a sharper, more sulphurous edge that lingered in the throat even after the fire had been banked for sleep. The residue it left inside the chimney was darker and more stubborn than would soot, requiring regular sweeping to prevent dangerous buildups that could ignite and threaten the entire roof. In rural districts, this task often fell to the household itself or to itinerant sweeps who traveled from village to village with their brushes and scrapers, their arrival marked by the faint scent of creosote that clung to their clothes. For those still living in the traditional single-room cottages without chimneys, and these remained common among the smaller tenants and laborers, the open hearth continued its patient work unchanged. The morning plumes of smoke rose through the thatch as they had for centuries, wrapping the interior in the same familiar haze that coated the rafters and settled into the folds of clothing with quiet persistence. The contrast between neighboring homes grew more pronounced as the Georgian period advanced. A yeoman who had prospered might sit with his family in a room where the air felt almost spacious by comparison, the fire contained within a proper fireplace that allowed for the addition of paneled walls or even a modest upper chamber without filling it with drifting smoke. Yet even here the practical trade-offs were evident. The chimney pulled heat upward more rapidly, demanding greater quantities of coal to maintain warmth, and on damp or windless mornings the smoke could still back down into the room in faint puffs that stung the eyes and left a faint metallic tang on the tongue. In the humbler cottages nearby, the central hearth offered its own steady, if hazy, comfort. The smoke cured the winter stores hanging from the beams, deterred pests more effectively than any alternative, and provided the only reliable light once darkness fell. Families there moved through their tasks with the same instinctive choreography, tilting the head when stirring the pot, positioning the youngest children nearer the floor where the air remained marginally clearer, accepting the low-level irritation as the unavoidable companion to survival in a world where warmth after sunset could not be separated from its smoky shadow. In the growing market towns and the expanding cities like London, the problem took on a different scale altogether. Rows of houses, many now equipped with multiple chimneys to serve upper floors, poured their collective smoke into the streets, creating a low-lying pall that mixed with the vapors from workshops and cookshops. Coal had become the fuel of necessity for thousands of households, its hotter burn essential in the denser, multi-storied buildings where an open central hearth would have been impractical. The air inside these urban homes cleared somewhat at living height thanks to the flues, but the background haze from neighboring chimneys often drifted back through windows or gaps in the construction, turning the ordinary act of breathing into a constant, low-grade negotiation. Clothes absorbed the sharper scent of coal smoke more deeply, and the soot that settled on windowsills and ledges required frequent wiping if any semblance of cleanliness was to be maintained. Civic authorities issued occasional ordinances about chimney heights and fuel quality, yet the daily reality for artisans, laborers, and their families remained one of persistent haze, the smoke rising from hundreds of hearths to form the hazy canopy that had become the signature atmosphere of town life. What makes this 18th century chapter especially layered is how the very improvements that lightened the air inside some homes created new burdens elsewhere. The rise of the professional chimney sweep, often employing small boys who could wriggle into the narrow flues of the new brick chimneys, spoke to the practical necessity of keeping the passages clear. These children, apprenticed young and working in conditions that left their skin and lungs coated in soot, represented a hidden cost of the cleaner interiors enjoyed by those who could afford the service. In the countryside, the sweep's visits were less frequent but no less essential. A blocked flue could turn a modest fire into a hazard, sending smoke pouring back into the room or, worse, igniting the accumulated creosote in a sudden roar. Families learned to listen for the scrape of brushes against brick as a routine part of seasonal maintenance, accepting it as another small ritual in the ongoing effort to live comfortably with fire. As the century drew toward its close and the first stirrings of industrial change began to appear on the horizon, the smoke continued to tell its own subtle history of adaptation across the social landscape. In rural districts where wood or peat remained the primary fuel, the older central hearths endured longest, their smoke rising each morning through the thatch with the same patient rhythm that had shaped medieval life. The air inside remained thick with the residue of centuries, the family routines unfolding in the half-lit haze that had become as familiar as the turning of the seasons. In the towns and the wealthier farmsteads, the chimneys and coal fires had reshaped daily existence in quieter ways. Meals prepared with less eye-watering effort, evenings spent in rooms that felt marginally more spacious, the persistent rasp in the throat somewhat eased for those who lived there year after year. Yet the coal smoke itself carried a new weight, its sulphurous bite hinting at the larger transformations that would arrive with the factories and mills of the coming decades. The long history of breathing that smoke, its quiet toll on lungs and eyes, its practical benefits for preservation and warmth, and the slow, uneven emergence of ways to tame it, remained woven into the fabric of ordinary life. In one such cottage, whether traditional or newly improved, the evening fire is tended once more as twilight deepens, the embers banked with deliberate care, while outside the English countryside settles under the same quiet sky that has watched these routines unfold for generations. The air carries the familiar scent of wood or coal. The family moves through its closing tasks with the instinctive adjustments born of long habit, and the smoke itself drifts upward in its patient columns, carrying forward the record of domestic existence into an era when larger forces of industry and population would test the old balances more thoroughly than ever before. New pressures are already gathering along the rivers and in the growing manufacturing districts, where the demand for fuel and the scale of production promise further variations in the atmosphere people breathe inside their homes, and the story of that smoke continues its unhurried advance across the landscape, one hearth and one chimney at a time. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, that unhurried advance began to accelerate under the pressures of a rapidly changing world, where the quiet rhythms of rural hearths met the growing demands of industry and urban expansion. In the early decades of the 1800s, the use of coal had become deeply entrenched across much of England, not only in the improved farmhouses of the south and east, but increasingly in the industrial districts of the north and Midlands, where factories and mills drew workers into crowded towns and the demand for fuel outstripped anything the woodlands could supply. Inside the homes of artisans and factory laborers, the chimney was now an expected feature, its brick flue rising above rows of terraced houses that stood shoulder to shoulder along newly laid streets. The smoke it carried away from the hearth burned hotter and more steadily than wood ever had, allowing families to keep a fire going through the long shifts of industrial life without the constant feeding that an open central hearth once required. Yet the air they breathed remained far from clear. Coal smoke, denser and more sulphurous than the wood smoke of earlier centuries, lingered in the flues and drifted back into the rooms on damp mornings, coating the walls with a finer, blacker residue that resisted even the most thorough sweeping. The practical realities of these new domestic spaces revealed their own quiet contradictions. A miner's cottage or a weaver's back-to-back house might have a proper fireplace, but the coal that fueled it came from the same pits where husbands and fathers spent their days, and the smoke it produced carried traces of the same dust that filled the lungs underground. Families noticed how the haze inside felt heavier after a night of burning cheaper slack coal. The small fragments and dust left over from larger pieces, its acrid bite sharper than the wood or peat their grandparents had known. Eyes watered more persistently, especially among the children who spent their days close to the hearth while their parents worked the looms or the forges. The chimney sweeps, now often young boys hired by the parish or by householders themselves, wriggled through the narrow flues with brushes and scrapers, their small bodies emerging blackened and coughing, a visible reminder that the cleaner air at head height came at a hidden cost elsewhere in the household economy. In the countryside, where older cottages still stood without full chimneys, the central hearth endured in pockets of resistance, its smoke rising through thatch or tile in the same patient columns. But even there the fuel had shifted. Coal or coke, carted from the nearest canal or railhead, mixed with whatever wood could be gathered, creating a hybrid haze that blended the old tang with the new metallic edge. What made this 19th century chapter particularly layered was how the smoke inside the home began to merge with the smoke outside it. In the growing manufacturing towns, the factories themselves poured vast columns of coal smoke into the sky, their chimneys taller and more insistent than any domestic flue. On still days, the industrial pall settled over entire districts, seeping through window frames and under doors so that the air a family breathed at night was not merely the product of their own hearth but a shared atmosphere laced with the residue of distant mills and foundries. Clothes hung to dry indoors absorbed the combined soot, and the morning ritual of opening the door revealed a world where the horizon itself often appeared veiled in a low, yellowish haze. Physicians of the period, noting the increase in respiratory complaints among urban populations, began to speak more openly of the smoky atmosphere that filled both factories and dwellings, though their observations rarely reached the ears of the laborers themselves. Families adapted as they always had, banking the fire with care before sleep, positioning the youngest nearest the floor where the air might be marginally clearer, speaking in measured tones that allowed breath to be drawn between phrases. But the scale of the haze had changed. It was no longer simply the companion to a single domestic fire. It had become the background to an entire way of life shaped by industry. Even in the more prosperous rural districts, the pattern held its own variations. A tenant farmer who had rebuilt his house with multiple fireplaces, each served by its own flue, could sit with his family in rooms where the air felt noticeably lighter than in the single hearth cottages of his laborers. The coal burned there was of better quality, the chimneys swept more regularly, and the evenings passed with fewer pauses to rub stinging eyes or clear irritated throats. Yet the practical trade-offs persisted. The improved draft pulled heat upward more quickly, requiring greater quantities of fuel to warm the larger spaces now common in such dwellings, and on windy nights the smoke could still back down in faint puffs that reminded everyone of the limits of even the best construction. In the humbler holdings nearby, the open hearth or rudimentary fireplace continued its work, the smoke curing the winter stores and deterring pests as it had for centuries, while the family moved through its tasks with the same instinctive choreography born of necessity. The contrast between these neighboring worlds had become part of the visible texture of the countryside itself. Chimney stacks rising in neat rows above the newer farmhouses, while the older cottages vented their haze through smoke holes or loose thatch, each contributing its share to the wider atmosphere. As the century progressed and the railways carried coal farther and faster than ever before, the reliance on it deepened in every corner of the realm. Urban reformers began to notice the cumulative effects, with reports of blackened buildings and persistent fogs that mixed coal smoke with natural mists. But inside the ordinary home, the daily experience remained intimate and immediate. A factory worker returning from a 12-hour shift would step into a room where the fire, kept burning low during the day by a child or elderly relative, had filled the space with its familiar haze, the scent of coal and cooking mingling with the sweat and dust of the mill. The evening meal was prepared in that atmosphere. The children learned their letters or mended tools by the fire's light, and sleep came in the same thickened air that had wrapped the household since dawn. The body adjusted in small, unspoken ways. Shallower breathing during tasks close to the hearth, a habitual tilt of the head when stirring the pot, a low cough that became as ordinary as the striking of the clock. These were not the dramatic sufferings of legend, but the quiet, accumulated toll of breathing smoke all day, year after year, in a world where fire remained the only reliable source of warmth, light, and cooked food. The long history of that smoke, its patient companionship through the medieval centuries, its gradual taming by chimneys, and its transformation under the weight of industrial coal, continued to evolve in ways that no single household could fully anticipate. In the terraced streets of the manufacturing towns, the chimneys rose higher to meet new building regulations, their flues designed with better drafts learned from engineers and architects. Yet the collective haze from thousands of fires and factories created an external pressure that no domestic improvement could entirely escape. In the countryside, the older patterns lingered longest among the smallest holdings, where the central hearth or simple fireplace still served as the pulsing center of existence, its smoke rising each morning with the same quiet persistence that had defined life for generations. Families there still banked the embers with deliberate care before sleep, still woke to the ritual of raking and feeding, still accepted the low-level irritation as part of the texture of survival. And so the story pressed onward into the middle decades of the 19th century, when new voices, reformers, physicians, and eventually legislators, began to question the price of progress in the air people breathed. In one such home, whether a smoky terraced cottage in Manchester or a traditional holding in the rural South, the evening fire is tended once more as twilight deepens, the embers coaxed back to life or banked for the night, while outside the English landscape settles under a sky that grows increasingly veiled by the smoke of industry. The air inside carries the familiar blend of coal and centuries of habit. The family moves through its closing routines with the instinctive adjustments that have shaped generations, and the smoke itself drifts upward in its patient columns, carrying forward the subtle record of domestic existence into an era when larger forces of reform and regulation would begin to test the old balances more directly than ever before. New ideas about public health and cleaner fuels are already stirring in the distance, promising further variations in the atmosphere of home, and the long rhythm of adaptation continues its advance across the landscape, one hearth and one chimney at a time, as the 19th century unfolds its own chapter in the quiet history of breathing smoke. New ideas about public health and cleaner fuels are already stirring in the distance, promising further variations in the atmosphere of home, and the long rhythm of adaptation continues its advance across the landscape, one hearth and one chimney at a time, as the 19th century unfolds its own chapter in the quiet history of breathing smoke. By the middle decades of the 1800s, those ideas had begun to find voice in medical journals and parliamentary reports, where physicians and reformers noted the rising toll of respiratory ailments in the industrial towns and traced much of it back to the pervasive coal smoke that filled both factories and the modest homes clustered around them. Inside a typical terraced cottage in Manchester or Leeds, the morning fire was still lit with the same careful ritual, but the coal now came from deeper pits and burned with a heavier, more acrid plume that the chimney struggled to carry away completely on damp, windless days. Families noticed how the haze seemed thicker after a night of burning the cheaper slack that many could afford, its sulfurous bite settling into the lungs and leaving a faint metallic taste that lingered long after breakfast. Children playing near the hearth learned early to keep their faces turned slightly aside, just as their medieval ancestors had done, while mothers stirred the pot with one hand and shielded their eyes with the other, the smoke no longer merely domestic but laced with the wider industrial pall that drifted in from the mill chimneys visible through the window. The practical contradictions of this era ran deeper than any single household could easily articulate. A proper brick chimney had become standard in most new urban dwellings, its flue designed with the improved drafts that engineers had learned from decades of trial and error, Yet the sheer volume of coal burned across an entire street created a collective haze that no individual flue could fully escape. On foggy mornings, the smoke from thousands of hearths mingled with the natural mist and the factory emissions to form the notorious pea super fogs that turned midday into twilight and left a greasy film on every surface. Inside the home, the air grew heavier still. Clothes hung to dry absorbed the combined soot, bedding carried the scent into sleep, and the evening meal was prepared in an atmosphere that stung the eyes more persistently than the wood smoke of earlier generations. Reformers began to speak of smoky air as a public nuisance rather than an inevitable fact of life. Yet for the laboring families whose wages depended on the very industries producing the smoke, the hearth remained the only reliable source of warmth and cooked food. They adapted as people always had, banking the embers with extra care before the night shift, positioning the youngest children in the clearer layer near the floor, speaking in the same measured cadence that allowed breath to be drawn between phrases. But the scale of the discomfort had grown with the scale of the cities themselves. In the countryside, the transition unfolded more slowly, yet even there the influence of coal and industry could be felt. A smallholder's cottage that still relied on a central hearth or rudimentary fireplace might burn a mix of peat, wood, and the occasional sack of coal carted from the nearest station, creating a hybrid haze that blended the old resinous tang with the sharper bite of mineral fuel. The smoke still rose through the thatch or tile as it had for centuries, curing the winter stores and deterring pests. But the air inside carried a new undertone that spoke of distant mines and railways. Families who could afford a modest chimney stack during a repair noticed the improvement immediately. Eyes watered less fiercely during the long winter evenings, conversations flowed with fewer interruptions, and the rafters accumulated soot more slowly. Yet the cost of sweeping those flues remained a seasonal expense, and the boys who performed the task, often the same children who helped around the hearth, emerged coughing and blackened, their small bodies navigating the narrow passages in a trade that had changed little since the previous century. The contrast between neighboring holdings grew sharper. The newer farmhouses with their multiple fireplaces and clearer air versus the older cottages where the smoke still wrapped the household in its familiar, patient embrace. As the century moved into its final decades, the first tentative steps toward regulation began to appear, though their impact on the ordinary home remained indirect and gradual. The Smoke Nuisance Abatement Act of 1853 and later measures aimed at factories had limited effect on domestic fires, where coal remained the cheapest and most accessible fuel for millions. Inside the terraced rows of Birmingham or Sheffield, the evening routine continued unchanged. The fire coaxed back to life after a day of work, the pottage simmering in its familiar haze, the children learning their lessons or mending clothes by the flickering light that no lamp could yet fully replace. Physicians recorded higher rates of bronchitis and other chest complaints among those who lived closest to the mills, yet the connection to the domestic hearth was often overshadowed by the more visible factory chimneys. Families learned to live with the heavier air as a fact of existence, much as their ancestors had accepted the medieval smoke. The body adjusted in small, unspoken ways, shallower breaths during tasks close to the fire, a habitual rub of the eyes, a low cough that became as ordinary as the striking of the clock. The lived experience of breathing that smoke in the late 19th century revealed a deeper irony that few at the time could fully appreciate. The very industrial progress that had made coal abundant and affordable had also multiplied its presence in the air people breathed from dawn until sleep. In the wealthier suburbs, where gas lighting and early experiments with cleaner stoves began to appear, some households could reduce their reliance on the open coal fire. Yet for the great majority, the hearth remained the pulsing center of home life, its smoke rising each morning with the same quiet persistence. The scent clung to hair and clothing with a new intensity. The residue on walls and ceilings darkened more rapidly, and the morning ritual of opening the door often revealed a world still veiled in the low, yellowish haze that had become the signature atmosphere of the age. Reformers and inventors spoke of new fuels and better stoves that might one day lighten the burden, but inside the ordinary cottage or terraced house, the daily reality remained rooted in the same practical necessities that had governed life for centuries. the need for heat, for cooked food, for light after sunset, and the acceptance of whatever atmosphere those necessities produced. By the turn of the 20th century, the story of indoor smoke had begun to intersect with larger currents of social and technological change that would eventually reach even the most modest thresholds. In the growing suburbs and some rural districts, the arrival of town gas supplies offered an alternative for cooking and lighting, reducing the need for a constant coal fire during the day. Yet the evening hearth often continued to burn for warmth, its smoke still drifting upward through the chimney in patient columns. Families noticed how the air felt marginally lighter on days when the gas ring supplemented the open fire, but the deeper transformation lay ahead. In one such home, whether a smoky urban terrace or a traditional country cottage, the evening fire is tended once more as twilight deepens, the embers coaxed or banked while outside the English landscape settles under a sky that carries the faint glow of distant factory chimneys. The air inside holds the familiar blend of coal and centuries of habit. The family moves through its closing routines with the instinctive adjustments born of long experience, and the smoke itself continues its quiet journey, carrying forward the subtle record of domestic existence into an era when cleaner technologies and bolder public health measures would begin to test the old balances more decisively than ever before. New possibilities with gas, electricity, and regulation are already taking shape on the horizon, and the long rhythm of adaptation presses onward across the landscape, one hearth at a time, as the 20th century stirs with its own promises and pressures. New possibilities with gas, electricity, and regulation are already taking shape on the horizon, and the long rhythm of adaptation presses onward across the landscape, one hearth at a time, as the 20th century stirs with its own promises and pressures. In the opening decades of the new century, many urban households began to welcome town gas into their kitchens for cooking and lighting, its blue flame offering a cleaner, more controllable heat than the open coal fire that still dominated the living room. Yet the coal fire itself remained the steadfast center of warmth in the majority of working-class homes, its smoke rising each morning through the chimney flue with the same quiet persistence that had defined domestic life for generations. A factory worker returning from a night shift in Manchester or Birmingham might step into a room where the fire, kept low during the day by a child or elderly relative, had filled the space with its familiar haze, the scent of coal mingling with the damp of the walls and the residue of yesterday's meal. Eyes still watered during the evening tasks. Throats carried the low rasp that had become as ordinary as the ticking of the mantel clock, and the youngest children instinctively positioned themselves nearer the floor where the air felt marginally less heavy. The gas ring might handle the kettle or the evening stew, reducing some of the smoke from cooking, but the open grate burned steadily for heat, its coal drawn from the same pits that employed so many in the household, its smoke carrying the same sulphurous edge that had sharpened over the previous century. The practical realities of these early 20th century homes revealed their own subtle ironies. A proper chimney had long since replaced the medieval smoke hole in most dwellings. Yet the sheer number of coal fires burning across row after row of terraced houses created a collective pall that no single flue could entirely dispel. On damp winter mornings, the haze from neighboring chimneys drifted back through cracked window frames or under doors, turning the interior into an extension of the street's smoky atmosphere. Families adapted with the same instinctive choreography their grandparents had known, tilting the head when stirring the pot, speaking in measured phrases to avoid drawing too deep a breath mid-sentence, banking the embers with deliberate care before sleep. But the background pressure of urban smoke had grown heavier. In the countryside, the older patterns lingered longer. A smallholder's cottage might still rely on a mix of coal and peat or wood gathered from the hedgerows, the smoke rising through the thatch or tile in patient columns that cured the winter stores and deterred pests as it always had. The air inside remained thick with the residue of centuries, the family routines unfolding in the half-lit haze that felt almost timeless, even as the railways and canals brought cheaper coal within easier reach. The First World War and then the Second tested these domestic arrangements in ways that no one had anticipated. Rationing of coal and coke during the conflicts forced households to burn whatever fuel could be obtained. Sometimes damper, smokier grades or mixtures stretched with peat and wood, sending thicker plumes curling upward through the flues and leaving a harsher bite in the throat. Blackout curtains kept windows sealed against the night, trapping the smoke inside for longer and making the evening hours feel smaller and more intimate. Families learned to bank the fire even more carefully to conserve precious fuel, the embers glowing faintly beneath layers of ash while the household slept in the same thickened air. Children born during these years grew up with the low-level irritation as an unremarkable part of existence, their eyes watering during homework by the grate, their clothing carrying the scent of coal deep into the fibers. Yet the fire remained the pulsing heart of the home, its warmth and light the only reliable companions through the long evenings of uncertainty, and the smoke its inseparable companion. In the years after the Second World War, the pace of change began to quicken in some districts, though it remained gradual and uneven across the country. Town gas supplies expanded into more suburban homes, allowing for the occasional gas fire or cooker that reduced the reliance on the open coal grate during milder days. Electricity, too, reached further into rural areas, bringing electric kettles and occasional radiant heaters that offered a cleaner alternative for short tasks. Yet for millions the coal fire endured as the primary source of heat, its smoke rising each morning with the same quiet rhythm. A miner's family in a colliery village might still receive a weekly coal allowance as part of his wages, the familiar sack stacked beside the hearth, the daily ritual of lighting and tending unchanged from the patterns of the previous century. The air inside these homes carried the same familiar tang, the residue darkening the walls more slowly now that chimneys were swept more regularly. But the low-level discomfort persisted for those who spent their days close to the grate. Then came the winter of 1952, when the long accumulation of domestic smoke met a rare alignment of weather and circumstance in London and other industrial centers. A high-pressure system settled over the city in early December, trapping cold air beneath a layer of warmer air above and preventing the smoke from thousands of coal fires and factories from dispersing. For 5 days, the haze thickened into a dense, yellowish fog that pressed down on the streets and seeped into every home. Inside the terraced houses of East London or the back streets of industrial towns, the air grew heavier than anyone could remember. Families kept their fires burning low for warmth against the bitter cold, but the smoke had nowhere to go, pooling at head height and stinging eyes with a new intensity. Breathing itself became something one managed rather than took for granted. Shallower breaths during the evening meal, children coughing quietly in their beds, the scent of coal smoke so thick it seemed to coat the inside of the mouth. The fog outside turned midday into twilight, but inside the homes the experience was intimate and unrelenting. The same atmosphere that had wrapped generations now grown suddenly, lethally heavy. Thousands fell ill in the days that followed, their chests tight with the accumulated irritation of years, and the event lingered in public memory as a stark reminder of how ordinary domestic fires could shape the air an entire city breathed. The response, when it came, was measured but consequential. The Clean Air Act of 1956 introduced smoke control zones across many urban areas, restricting the burning of ordinary coal in domestic grates and offering grants to homeowners who converted to smokeless fuels, gas, oil, or electricity. In the designated zones, families were encouraged, sometimes required, to replace their open fires with approved appliances that burned coke or other processed fuels with far less smoke. The transition was far from immediate. Many households continued to burn coal where enforcement was light or where the grants took time to reach them, and the familiar ritual of lighting the grate each morning persisted in rural districts and smaller towns untouched by the new regulations. Yet the lived experience began to shift for those who made the change. A family in a newly designated smoke control area might notice how the air at head height cleared noticeably on winter evenings, eyes watering less fiercely during the preparation of the meal, conversations flowing without the constant small adjustments of posture. The chimney still required sweeping, but the residue it collected was lighter, and the background haze from neighboring homes diminished as more households converted. By the 1960s, the discovery of natural gas beneath the North Sea accelerated the transformation in ways that reached deeper into ordinary homes. Government-led conversion programs replaced town gas with the cleaner-burning natural variety, and small-bore central heating systems, once a luxury of the middle classes, began to appear in more modest dwellings. Radiators replaced the open grate in many living rooms, their steady warmth spreading evenly without the need for constant tending or the inevitable plume of smoke. Families who made the switch spoke of evenings that felt subtly more spacious, the air freer of the low-level rasp that had accompanied every winter for as long as anyone could remember. Children no longer learned the instinctive tilts of the head or the habit of rubbing stinging eyes. The youngest could sit closer to the warmth without the familiar haze drifting around them. Yet the change carried its own quiet contradictions. Some older householders missed the flickering light and comforting crackle of the coal fire, the way it had drawn the family together in a single glowing circle. The scent of coal smoke, once the signature of home, gave way to the fainter, almost neutral atmosphere of gas or electric heat, and the rituals of banking embers and fetching scuttles faded into memory. In the countryside, the older patterns endured longest among the smallest holdings, where a simple open fire or modest stove still served as the center of warmth on the coldest nights. A farm laborer's cottage might burn smokeless fuels where required, but the smoke that rose from the chimney on a winter morning still carried traces of the old ways. The air inside thick with habit even as the wider world moved toward cleaner alternatives. The contrast between neighboring homes grew sharper once again. The newer bungalows with their central heating and clearer interiors versus the traditional cottages where the grate remained the pulsing heart of existence, its smoke rising each morning with the same patient persistence. Families there still positioned themselves instinctively in the clearer layers during the evening meal, still accepted the low-level irritation as part of the texture of rural life, even as grants and regulations slowly reached them. As the 20th century moved into its later decades, the long history of breathing that smoke, its patient companionship through centuries of open hearths, its gradual taming by chimneys and regulations, and its transformation under the weight of industrial coal and then cleaner fuels, continued to evolve in quiet, personal ways. In one such home, whether a converted terraced house in a smoke control zone or a traditional cottage on the edge of a village, the evening warmth is tended once more as twilight deepens, the grate or radiator holding steady while outside the English landscape settles under a sky that carries far less of the old pall than it once did. The air inside holds the fainter scent of gas or electricity blended with the residue of memory. The family moves through its closing routines with adjustments that grow less necessary with each passing year, and the smoke itself, where it still rises at all, drifts upward in thinner columns, carrying forward the subtle record of domestic existence into an era when even newer technologies and environmental awareness would continue to reshape the atmosphere people breathed inside their homes. The rhythm of adaptation presses onward still, shaped by the same practical necessities and quiet ambitions that have always governed how families make their spaces livable, one hearth at a time across the changing landscape of the later 20th century. The rhythm of adaptation presses onward still, shaped by the same practical necessities and quiet ambitions that have always governed how families make their spaces livable, one hearth at a time across the changing landscape of the later 20th century. In the closing decades of the 1900s, central heating systems, once reserved for the more affluent, spread into a wider circle of ordinary homes as gas and oil boilers became more affordable and reliable. Radiators replaced the open grate in many living rooms and kitchens, their steady, smokeless warmth spreading evenly through the house without the need for daily tending or the inevitable morning plume that had defined winters for centuries. Families who made the switch noticed how the air felt lighter almost at once. Eyes no longer watered during the evening meal, throats carried no persistent rasp, and the youngest children could sit anywhere in the room without instinctively seeking the clearer layer near the floor. The scent of coal smoke, once the signature of home itself, faded from clothing and bedding, replaced by the faint, neutral warmth of gas or the hum of an electric heater. In terraced streets where smoke control zones had long been in force, the collective haze that once hung over entire neighborhoods lifted noticeably on cold mornings, and the chimneys that had risen in neat rows now stood largely unused or capped, their flues swept only for safety rather than necessity. Yet the transition carried its own quiet contradictions, ones that echoed the practical trade-offs of earlier centuries. Some older householders missed the flickering light and comforting crackle of the coal fire, the way it had drawn the family into a single glowing circle on long winter evenings, and the rituals of fetching scuttles or banking embers slipped quietly into memory. In rural districts, the change came more slowly. A farm cottage might retain a wood-burning stove or an occasional open fire where regulations allowed smokeless fuels, the smoke rising in thinner columns through a modern flue that drew more efficiently than any medieval thatch. The air inside remained tinged with a faint resinous tang on certain nights, a reminder of older ways, while the rest of the house warmed through radiators or underfloor systems that required no daily attention. Families there still positioned themselves by habit during the coldest spells, but the low-level irritation that had once accompanied every task had eased into something almost forgotten. The body adjusted again, breathing more deeply and naturally, yet the memory of smoke lingered in the rafters of older cottages and in the stories passed down from grandparents who could still describe the sting of eyes and the rasp in the throat as an ordinary part of life. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, new pressures from environmental awareness and energy costs began to reshape the atmosphere of home once more. Concerns over carbon emissions and air quality prompted many households to install high-efficiency wood burners or pellet stoves in place of older open fires, their advanced flues and filters capturing far more of the particulate matter that had once drifted freely. The smoke that rose from these modern appliances was cleaner and less visible, yet it carried a subtle, almost nostalgic scent of wood on clear evenings, drawing families closer to the hearth in ways that felt both contemporary and deeply familiar. In urban flats and suburban homes, electric storage heaters and heat pumps offered entirely smokeless alternatives, their warmth generated without flame or flue, leaving the air inside crisp and neutral. Children born in these years grew up without the instinctive tilts of the head or the habit of rubbing stinging eyes. The morning ritual of lighting a fire had become optional, a choice rather than a necessity, and the daily haze that had wrapped generations in its patient embrace had thinned to a memory preserved in old photographs and oral histories. Even so, the long story of breathing smoke revealed new layers in the early decades of the new century. While domestic coal fires had largely vanished in regulated zones, the wider atmosphere outside, shaped by traffic emissions, industrial remnants, and occasional wood smoke from neighboring stoves, continued to seep indoors through open windows or ventilation systems on still days. Families learned to monitor indoor air quality with small sensors, noticing how the residue of outdoor pollution could still accumulate in carpets and curtains, a faint echo of the collective haze their great-grandparents had known. In some rural communities, the revival of wood as a renewable fuel brought back the soft crackle of the hearth, its smoke carefully managed by catalytic converters and insulated flues that kept the interior air clearer than any medieval cottage could have imagined. The practical benefits that had sustained the open fire for centuries, warmth, light, and a gathering point for the household, remained, but now balanced against stricter standards for emissions and efficiency. The body, long accustomed to subtle adjustments, relaxed further. Breathing grew easier, sleep deeper, and the evenings felt subtly more spacious. What makes this contemporary chapter especially revealing is how the absence of domestic smoke has quietly altered the texture of daily life in ways both expected and unforeseen. Homes once filled with the low, persistent tang of coal or would now carry the cleaner scent of fresh laundry or the faint ozone of an air purifier. Yet some families deliberately choose a wood burner on special occasions, savoring the way the controlled smoke draws everyone together around its glow. In older houses, the blackened rafters or soot-stained chimney breasts have been cleaned or painted over, erasing visible traces of centuries of haze, while the memory of it survives in local museums and family anecdotes. The transition has not been uniform. In pockets of older housing stock or among those who prefer traditional heating, a modest fire still burns, its smoke rising through updated flues that comply with modern regulations while preserving something of the old companionship. The air inside these homes carries a lighter version of the familiar scent, a bridge between past and present that feels almost comforting in its restraint. As the years advance further into the 21st century, larger currents of climate awareness and technological innovation continue to press the rhythm of adaptation forward. Heat pumps powered by renewable electricity offer the promise of entirely smokeless warmth for more households, their quiet operation replacing the crackle of flame with the subtle hum of efficiency. Government incentives and community programs encourage the replacement of older stoves with low-emission models, and public health campaigns highlight the benefits of cleaner indoor air for respiratory health across all ages. In one such home, whether a renovated terraced house in a former industrial town or a countryside cottage updated with modern heating, the evening warmth is maintained once more as twilight deepens, the radiator or stove holding steady, while outside the English landscape settles under a sky far clearer than it was a century ago. The air inside holds the faint, neutral scent of contemporary comfort blended with the residue of memory. The family moves through its closing routines with adjustments that have grown almost unnecessary, and the smoke itself, where it still rises at all, drifts upward in carefully managed columns, carrying forward the subtle record of domestic existence into an era when even newer forms of energy and environmental stewardship will continue to test and refine the old balances. New possibilities with solar-assisted systems and smarter ventilation are already emerging on the horizon, and the long rhythm of adaptation presses onward still, shaped by the same practical necessities and quiet ambitions that have guided families for centuries, one hearth at a time across the evolving landscape of home. The long rhythm of adaptation presses onward still, shaped by the same practical necessities and quiet ambitions that have guided families for centuries, one hearth at a time, across the evolving landscape of home. In the early decades of the 21st century, solar-assisted heating systems began appearing in more homes, particularly in new builds and retrofitted properties where photovoltaic panels on the roof could supplement the warmth provided by heat pumps or underfloor heating. The air inside these dwellings felt different, cleaner, more consistent, with no trace of the haze that once defined the domestic interior. Families noticed how mornings unfolded without the ritual of lighting a fire or adjusting vents. The warmth simply arrived, silent and invisible, allowing the household to move through its tasks in an atmosphere that felt almost weightless compared to the smoky embrace of earlier eras. Eyes no longer watered during breakfast preparation, throats carried no low rasp from overnight embers, and the youngest children could play anywhere in the room without the instinctive tilt of the head that generations before them had learned as naturally as breathing. The scent that once clung to clothing and bedding had vanished entirely, replaced by the faint, neutral freshness of filtered air circulating through mechanical ventilation systems that quietly exchanged stale indoor air for cleaner outdoor drafts. Yet, even in these technologically advanced homes, the practical contradictions of heating remained quietly present. A family in a suburban semi-detached house might enjoy the steady warmth of a heat pump on most days, but on the coldest winter nights they sometimes supplemented it with a modern wood-burning stove, its controlled flames and low-emission design offering a visual and emotional comfort that no radiator could quite replicate. The smoke from these stoves rose through highly efficient flues fitted with catalytic converters and particulate filters, emerging from the chimney as little more than a faint, almost invisible wisp. Inside the room the air stayed remarkably clear, yet the soft crackle and the gentle resinous scent still drew everyone closer to the hearth on long evenings, recreating in miniature the gathering instinct that had bound medieval households around their central fires. The trade-off was carefully managed. The stove burned only seasoned, dry wood or specially processed pellets, and the family monitored indoor air quality with small digital sensors that displayed particulate levels in real time on their phones. The body, long adapted to subtle irritations, now relaxed into a new normal. Breathing felt deeper and more effortless, sleep arrived more readily, and the evenings carried a subtle sense of spaciousness that earlier generations would have found startlingly luxurious. Across the countryside and in smaller market towns, the revival of wood as a renewable fuel added another layer to the story. In regions where local forestry and sustainable coppicing had made seasoned logs readily available, many households installed high-efficiency stoves as a deliberate choice, balancing environmental concerns with the desire for a living flame. The smoke that rose from these appliances was far thinner and cleaner than anything their great-grandparents had known. Yet on still autumn evenings it could still carry a faint, nostalgic tang across the garden, a reminder of older domestic rhythms. Families who chose this path often spoke of the way the stove became the new center of the home, its warmth and light pulling children away from screens and encouraging conversation in the same half-circle arrangement that once surrounded the open medieval hearth. The air inside remained largely free of the old irritation, but the ritual of loading the firebox each evening and adjusting the air vents brought back a small, satisfying sense of participation in the process of staying warm. For those in older cottages with thick stone walls and high ceilings, the stove's efficiency helped preserve the building's character while quietly reducing the particulate load that had once blackened rafters over centuries. In densely populated urban areas, the focus shifted toward smarter ventilation and whole-house systems that actively filtered and circulated air. Post-pandemic awareness of indoor air quality had heightened sensitivities. Many families installed mechanical ventilation with heat recovery, systems that extracted warmth from outgoing stale air and transferred it to incoming fresh air without allowing smoke or pollutants to linger. The result was an interior atmosphere that felt almost hospital clean on ordinary days, free of the low-level haze that had once been accepted as inevitable. Cooking, once a major source of domestic smoke in open kitchens, now happened on induction hobs or in ovens with powerful extractor fans that whisked away any vapors before they could accumulate. Children growing up in these homes learned none of the instinctive adjustments their ancestors had known. They breathed easily while doing homework at the kitchen table, their lungs carrying no memory of the chronic cough or watering eyes that had marked so many childhoods in earlier centuries. The practical necessities of warmth and cooked food remained, but they had been decoupled from the visible plume that once rose from every hearth. What makes this 21st century chapter especially layered is how the absence of domestic smoke has quietly reshaped not only the air people breathe but the very texture of family life itself. Homes once filled with the constant low hum of irritation now offer spaces where conversation flows more freely, where the elderly can sit closer to the warmth without discomfort, and where the simple act of breathing feels unremarkable rather than something to be managed. Yet nostalgia for the old ways persists in subtle forms. Some households keep a small, decorative fire pit in the garden for summer evenings, its controlled smoke drifting harmlessly upward while the family gathers around it under clearer skies. In rural communities, the debate over wood burners continues in planning meetings and local forums, balancing the desire for renewable heat against concerns over particulate matter in valley bottoms where smoke can settle on still nights. The body, freed from centuries of low-level exposure, shows its gratitude in quieter ways. Fewer winter chest complaints, clearer mornings, and a general sense of lightness that earlier generations might have struggled to imagine. As the years move deeper into the 21st century, larger currents of climate policy and technological innovation continue to press the rhythm of adaptation forward in ways that reach even the most modest thresholds. Government incentives for heat pumps and solar thermal systems encourage more households to abandon any remaining fossil fuel dependence, while smart home technologies allow precise monitoring and adjustment of indoor air quality from a distance. In one such home, Whether a renovated Victorian terrace fitted with a whole-house ventilation system or a countryside cottage warmed by a modern wood stove and supplemented by solar panels, the evening warmth is maintained once more as twilight deepens, the radiators or stove holding steady, while outside the English landscape settles under skies that carry far less of the industrial pall than they did only a generation ago. The air inside holds the faint, neutral scent of contemporary comfort blended with occasional traces of carefully managed wood smoke. The family moves through its closing routines with adjustments that have grown almost unnecessary, and the smoke itself, where it still rises at all, drifts upward in tightly controlled columns, carrying forward the subtle record of domestic existence into an era when even newer forms of renewable energy, hydrogen boilers, and community district heating networks promise to refine the atmosphere of home still further. The long rhythm of adaptation presses onward, shaped by the same practical necessities and quiet ambitions that have guided families for centuries, one hearth at a time across the evolving landscape of home. The long rhythm of adaptation presses onward, shaped by the same practical necessities and quiet ambitions that have guided families for centuries, one hearth at a time across the evolving landscape of home. In the second and third decades of the 21st century, the quiet revolution in domestic heating has deepened further as community district heating networks and hydrogen-ready boilers begin to appear in pilot schemes across towns and cities. These systems draw warmth from centralized plants, often powered by a mix of renewables, waste heat from industry, or emerging hydrogen supplies, and deliver it through insulated pipes directly into individual homes without any flame or flue inside the building itself. Families in the first neighborhoods to adopt them notice an almost startling absence of any atmospheric residue. The air inside remains consistently crisp and neutral, even on the coldest days, with no morning ritual of lighting or venting required. The subtle mechanical hum of circulation pumps replaces the crackle of wood or the faint hiss of gas, and the evenings unfold in rooms where breathing feels effortless in a way that would have seemed almost unimaginable to the medieval household huddled around its central hearth. Children born into these homes grow up without any inherited memory of stinging eyes or the low rasp that once accompanied every winter task, their daily lives shaped instead by the steady, invisible comfort that has finally decoupled warmth from combustion in the domestic space. Yet the practical realities of this latest chapter carry their own layered ironies, echoing the trade-offs that have threaded through the entire story. A family in a retrofitted Victorian terrace might enjoy the even warmth of district heating on ordinary days, but on occasions when they choose to kindle a modern low-emission stove for the sake of tradition or atmosphere, they do so with the knowledge that its filtered smoke is carefully monitored and minimized. The faint, controlled wisp that rises from the chimney on those evenings carries almost none of the particulate burden that once blackened rafters over centuries. Yet it still evokes the gathering instinct that once bound entire households together in the smoky half-light. In rural areas where district heating remains distant, many households have turned to advanced air source heat pumps paired with solar batteries, their efficiency improved by smart controls that learn the family's rhythms and adjust output accordingly. The air inside these cottages feels lighter still, the old stone walls no longer holding the residue of generations of soot, and the morning light filters through windows that stay clearer without the constant film of domestic haze. The body, long conditioned to subtle irritations across the centuries, now registers the change in quieter ways. Deeper sleep, fewer seasonal coughs, and a general sense of respiratory ease that earlier generations accepted only as the privilege of the wealthiest. Across the United Kingdom, the pace of this shift has varied by region and by household circumstance. In the former industrial heartlands of the North, where smoke control zones have been in place for decades, the conversion to cleaner systems has accelerated with government grants and local incentives. Yet pockets of older housing stock still retain a simple wood burner or pellet stove for supplementary heat. Families there often describe the dual experience: the clean, background warmth of the heat pump during the day giving way to the gentle glow of the stove on winter evenings. its smoke managed so precisely that the interior air quality sensors register barely any change. In the countryside of East Anglia or the Welsh borders, where sustainable woodland management has made local logs abundant, the modern wood stove has become a deliberate lifestyle choice for many, its advanced combustion chamber and electrostatic filters ensuring that the smoke rising through the flue is thinner and cleaner than anything produced in the open hearths of the Middle Ages. The scent that drifts across the garden on still evenings is lighter, almost nostalgic, and the household gathers around it with the same half-circle instinct that once surrounded the central fire, though now without the accompanying sting or the need to position the youngest members on the floor for clearer air. What continues to make this ongoing evolution especially revealing is how the gradual disappearance of domestic smoke has quietly altered not only the physical atmosphere, but the intangible texture of daily life inside the home. Conversations around the evening warmth flow more freely without the constant small adjustments of posture or breath. The elderly can sit closer to the source of heat without discomfort, and the simple act of preparing a meal or helping children with homework happens in air that feels unburdened by the low-level haze that once wrapped every task. Yet the memory of smoke lingers in cultural ways, in local history societies that restore old chimney breasts for display, in family stories told by grandparents who can still recall the rasp in the throat on winter mornings, and in the deliberate choice some households make to keep a small, decorative fire pit in the garden for summer gatherings where the controlled smoke rises harmlessly into clearer skies. The body has adapted again, breathing more deeply and naturally, and the evenings carry a subtle spaciousness that earlier centuries would have found almost startlingly luxurious. As the 21st century moves deeper into its third decade, larger currents of net zero policy and technological refinement continue to press the rhythm forward in ways that reach even the most modest thresholds. Emerging hydrogen boilers promise to deliver fully decarbonized flame heat where families prefer it, while community-scale heat networks expand into more neighborhoods, drawing warmth from rivers, mines, or geothermal sources that require no combustion inside the home at all. In one such dwelling, whether a newly built eco-home warmed entirely by renewable electricity or an older cottage retrofitted with a high-efficiency stove and solar-assisted heat pump, the evening comfort is maintained once more as twilight deepens, the system holding steady while outside the British landscape settles under skies that carry far less of the old pall than at any point in the past 7 centuries. The air inside holds the faint, neutral scent of contemporary efficiency, blended with occasional traces of carefully managed wood smoke on special evenings. The family moves through its closing routines with adjustments that have grown almost unnecessary, and the smoke itself, where it still rises at all, drifts upward in tightly controlled and filtered columns, carrying forward the subtle record of domestic existence into an era when even newer forms of renewable integration, smart grid balancing, and public health initiatives will continue to refine the atmosphere people breathe inside their homes. The long rhythm of adaptation presses onward, shaped by the same practical necessities and quiet ambitions that have guided families from the wattle and daub cottages of the 13th century to the connected, low-emission dwellings of today, one hearth at a time across the evolving landscape of home. The long rhythm of adaptation presses onward, shaped by the same practical necessities and quiet ambitions that have guided families from the wattle and daub cottages of the 13th century to the connected, low-emission dwellings of today, one hearth at a time across the evolving landscape of home. And so, across more than 7 centuries, the story of breathing smoke in England has unfolded not as a sudden revolution but as a patient, often invisible negotiation between the need for warmth and the quiet cost of living inside it. What began as the unrelenting haze of the open central hearth, filling single-room cottages with wood smoke that stung the eyes, rasped the throat, and shaped every movement from dawn until sleep, gradually yielded to chimneys, to coal, to regulation, and finally to the cleaner technologies that now allow so many homes to hold warmth without the old companion of haze. The medieval peasant family banked its embers each night knowing the morning would bring the same thick air. The Victorian mill worker returned from the factory to a room still veiled in coal smoke. the post-war household watched the Clean Air Act slowly lift the pall from terrace streets. Each generation adapted in its own way, learning the instinctive tilts of the head, the measured cadence of speech, the positioning of children nearer the floor, all while the fire itself remained the pulsing heart of survival, light, and togetherness. Looking back across that long arc, one sees not merely a tale of technological progress but something more intimate, the way an ordinary domestic reality quietly molded bodies, routines, and even the very atmosphere of home life for century after century. The smoke was never just discomfort. It was a working partner in preservation and pest control, a source of light when candles were luxuries, and the background medium in which family stories were told and meals prepared. Its persistence shaped social patterns too, binding households closer together in the shared haze, while marking subtle distinctions between the clearer air of the manor hall and the thicker atmosphere of the laborer's cottage. Modern reconstructions and surviving accounts remind us how heavy that air could be, yet people endured it not through complaint but through the same quiet practicality that has always defined the human relationship with fire. The gradual taming of that smoke, through stone flues and civic ordinances, through smokeless fuels and heat pumps, speaks to a deeper ingenuity, the slow realization that warmth need not come at the price of breathable air, and that the comforts we now take for granted were earned through generations of small, cumulative adjustments. In the homes of today, the contrast feels almost profound. The air inside is often neutral and clear, warmed by systems that require no daily tending and produce no visible plume. Families move through their evenings without the old rituals of banking embers or shielding eyes, and children grow up breathing easily in rooms that once would have carried the constant tang of wood or coal. Yet the memory of smoke lingers in the fabric of the past, in restored chimney breasts, in local museums displaying blackened thatch, and in the stories older relatives still tell of mornings when the haze was simply the atmosphere of home. That long companionship has left its trace not only in historical records but in the subtle relief we feel when we step into a modern interior and realize how lightly the air now sits upon us. Perhaps what lingers most is the quiet resilience of ordinary people who lived inside that smoke for so many lifetimes, accepting it as the necessary price of warmth and light while slowly, unevenly, finding ways to ease its burden. The story is not one of triumph over nature but of patient coexistence with it, of learning to breathe alongside the fire rather than against it, until technology and collective will allow the fire to give its gifts without exacting quite so heavy a toll. I wonder, as you settle back into the present after this long journey through the centuries, what detail from that smoky world surprised you most? Or which part of daily life in those earlier homes feels hardest to imagine enduring yourself? If these calm, thoughtful explorations of the past have kept you company through quiet evenings, I hope you'll consider returning for the next one. There is always more history waiting in the shadows, ready to unfold at its own unhurried pace. Until then, thank you for listening. Sleep well,